desert was breathing, that slow, steady kind of breath you only notice when everything else has gone still. Somewhere, out in the scrubland, a coyote let out a lonely yip. Not urgent, not scared, just a voice carried to no one in particular. The sky overhead was soft and purple. Clouds stretched like worn linen across the horizon. Twilight had slipped in, and the sun was folding itself away behind distant ridgelines, casting the land in bronze and shadow. And out of that last light, he rode, the stranger. Dust trailed behind him like a memory, faint and slow-moving. He sat upright in the saddle, his silhouette steady, not in a hurry, not entirely at ease. His hat brim drooped low over his brow, and his long duster coat fluttered against the flanks of a chestnut mare with a pale blaze down her nose. No name announced him, no rider rode beside him, just the rhythm of hooves and the slow exhale of the land. Beyond a shallow bluff, a wooden sign leaned into the wind. The paint was peeling, and the letters barely held on. It read, "Welcome to Mercy Ridge," a forgotten name for a nearly forgotten place. Once, this town had pulsed with life. Wagons rolled through with freight, miners passed through with gold dreams, and families huddled close around their hopes. But time had its way. Fires swept through the outer barns. Wells dried. The freight wagons stopped coming. One by one, doors were shuttered. Laughter faded, and only the stubborn or heartbroken remained. Now, a handful of souls kept the place breathing. Tonight, the stranger joined them. He reached the edge of town as the last shimmer of sun sank behind the hills. There wasn't much to greet him. A lantern flickered in the window of an old saloon, its name too faded to read. The general store had its front porch light strung with old tin stars, gently swaying in the warm wind. Tin somewhere farther down, a harmonica drifted through the dusk, played slow and easy by fingers that had known the quiet too long. The stranger pulled up near a watering trough, the wood cracked but still holding cool rainwater from a storm that had passed days before. His mare drank gratefully, and he stepped down, boots pressing into the fine dust of the street. He took off his hat, wiped the sweat from his brow, and looked around like a man measuring not what he could take, but what might still remain. Across the street, the saloon doors creaked. Out stepped an older man, tall and wiry, with a limp that told of some bullet long ago. His beard was silver, thick around the chin, and his eyes had that clear, slow wisdom that folks only earned by outliving pain. "You lost," the man called, not unfriendly, just curious. The stranger shook his head. "No, sir, just passing through." The old-timer nodded. "Most folks don't pass through here anymore. Not unless they're looking for something they ain't quite named yet." The stranger gave a faint smile, polite and tired. "Maybe that's so." There was silence between them for a moment, the kind that didn't feel awkward, just wide open, like a dry riverbed waiting for the rain. Then the older man stepped off the porch. "To name's Ezra Cole," he said, offering a hand. The stranger took it. "Call me Luke." "Luke," Ezra repeated, like he was turning the name over in his mind. "Well, Luke, you hungry?" Luke looked down the street. "A warm meal wouldn't be unwelcome." Ezra smiled. "We got stew going, and cornbread still warm. Come on, I'll introduce you to the rest." They walked together, slow and quiet, past shuttered homes and leaning fences. The smell of sage and wood smoke lingered in the air. Far off, the low whistle of wind curled around the rocks like a lullaby. They came to a wide clearing behind the church, the roof half mended, the bell long gone, and in its shadow, a ring of stones circled a flickering fire. Around it, half a dozen souls sat, shoulders relaxed, faces lit by orange glow. They were old ranch hands, a widowed mother with her daughter, a school teacher who kept a journal and baked for therapy, and a young boy named Nate, who asked questions like they were the most important thing in the world. They looked up as Ezra approached, and nobody flinched when the stranger stepped into the circle. This was a place where names didn't come before the warmth of the fire, or the first scoop of stew. Luke sat down on an old log, took the tin plate offered, and listened. They talked of small things, a coyote seen near the east fence, a calf born with a crooked leg, a letter from a cousin back east. They didn't speak in grand tales or dramatic tones, just the soft storytelling of people making sense of the days behind and the ones ahead. Laughter came not in bursts, but like ripples in a creek, and after a time, they asked him nothing, not about where he came from, not about what he'd lost. They just let him be. The fire popped softly, the wind stirred the mesquite, and someone handed him a harmonica. He held it for a moment, the cool metal catching the light. Then, almost without thinking, he raised it to his lips. A single low note drifted out, clear and haunting. He followed it with another, and then another. The tune was slow, sad, but not broken. It wandered, like someone searching for a trail long lost in the hills. When he stopped, no one spoke. They just sat, the fire crackling between them, and let the night do the talking. Above them, the stars blinked awake, ancient and steady, watching as one more soul began to find rest in the dust. The wind carried the scent of creosote and old cedar as the embers dimmed to a gentle red glow. Around the fire, folks leaned back against logs and rocks, bellies full and minds eased. The silence was a welcome one, soft as a blanket drawn over the end of a long day. Luke hadn't planned to stay, he never really did. For the last few years he'd moved from one edge of the map to another, small towns, cattle trails, dry canyons, with more echoes than voices. The places changed, but the ache he carried never did. Something unspoken stayed in his bones, a grief without ceremony. It didn't shout, it whispered, long and low. He didn't talk about it, didn't need to, but something about Mercy Ridge, its quiet resilience, the easy way these people made room at their fire, made the silence feel less lonely. From across the flames, the boy, Nate, scooted closer, about 9 years old, freckles across his cheeks, and that wild curiosity that hadn't yet been tamed by the world. "Your horse got a name?" he asked. Luke gave a quiet nod. "Sable, that's short for something." Luke chuckled softly, surprising himself. "No, she just looked like a shadow when I found her. Barely old enough to stand, born near a canyon wash during a storm. She's been with me since." The boy grinned, content with the answer. "She's real pretty, fast, faster than most," Luke said, then leaned in. "But don't tell her I said that. She'll get cocky." That earned a giggle, the kind that made Ezra glance over and smile beneath his beard. As the fire settled into coals, folks began to peel away, one by one. Ezra stood, stretched his back, and nodded toward a small bunkhouse near the edge of the clearing. "Got an extra cot in there?" he offered. Luke hesitated, then gave a grateful nod. "I'll take it." The bunkhouse was simple, a long wooden room with rough-hewn walls and the faint scent of pine and old tobacco. One cot sat empty in the corner, a wool blanket folded neatly on top. Luke set down his pack and unbuckled his boots, moving slow. His body wasn't young anymore, but it still remembered the rhythm of travel. He lay down without a word, hands behind his head, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. Through a nearby window, moonlight spilled in pale and still. Outside, the night sounds of the west took over, crickets murmuring in the brush, the rustle of a breeze through dry grass, and the occasional snort of a horse settling in for sleep. Luke let the sounds wash over him, breathing slow, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the land. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't dream of the fire. Not the one that had taken everything, not the one that had left him alone. Instead he saw stars, spread wide across the sky, like lanterns for the lost, and beneath them, the memory of his wife's voice, not in sorrow but in laughter, the way she used to sing to the horses when no one else was listening. He held that memory like a photograph in the dark. By morning, the world had turned soft again, dawn spreading like peach-colored silk across the horizon. Birds began their chatter, and the smell of frying bacon drifted in from outside. Luke sat up slowly, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and felt a stiffness in his shoulders that came with age and miles. He stepped out into the cool air, the sky above still brushed with early mist. Across the clearing, Ezra stood by a skillet over a camp stove, flipping biscuits and humming a tune. "Sleep all right?" Ezra asked without turning. "Better than I have in a while." "Then we're off to a good start." Luke joined him, took a tin cup of coffee, and sipped in silence. Around them, the others stirred to life. Miss Hattie from the schoolhouse walking with a basket of laundry, the widow Miriam feeding chickens behind her garden fence, and old Gus tightening the gate hinges near the livery. It was a town moving slow, but moving still. Ezra handed over a plate. "We've got a fence that needs mending over by the north pasture. Some of the posts rotted through last rain. You any good with wire and hammer?" Luke looked at him. "I can hold my own." Ezra gave a nod, like that answer meant more than it sounded. "You don't owe us anything, Luke, but if you feel like staying busy, I'd like that," Luke said. "Idle hands don't sit well with me." Later that morning, he found himself with a set of tools and a worn pair of gloves, walking the fence line with Nate tagging along. The boy carried a small pail of nails like it was treasure. "So were you ever a sheriff?" Nate asked, eyes wide. "Nope." "A bounty hunter?" "No." The boy squinted up at him. "A gunfighter?" Luke chuckled. "I was a rancher. Long time ago." "Oh." Nate looked disappointed, then perked up. "Did you have cattle?" "Lots. And stubborn ones too. Like to break fence boards just for fun." Nate grinned. "Just like ours." They worked for hours, side by side, the fence slowly coming back to life with each repaired post. Luke found comfort in the work, the rhythm of hammer and nail, the sun on his back, and the land stretching wide around him like an old friend. By mid-afternoon, they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, sharing water from a canteen. The silence returned, but this time, it felt like company, not something to escape, but something to share. Luke looked out over the fields, the mountains hazy in the distance. "You ever wonder why people stay in a place like this?" he asked quietly. Nate shrugged. "Mama says it's because this land remembers who we are, that it don't forget easy, so we shouldn't either." Luke stared at the boy, surprised by the answer. "Your mama's a wise woman," he said. The boy nodded solemnly, as if agreeing with something ancient, and in that moment, something in Luke shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but like the wind changing direction, slow and steady. He was still a stranger, but the dust didn't feel so heavy anymore. The sun climbed higher, casting long fingers of heat across the dry plains, but the air stayed kind, not blistering, not cruel, just warm enough to remind the skin it was alive. Luke tipped his hat back as he walked the path into town, the repaired fence line behind him, and the steady thump of his boots, mixing with the rustle of dry weeds along the trail. Sable waited by the trough near the general store, swishing her tail lazily, one ear tilted toward the clink of a horseshoe being nailed on in the distance. She gave a soft snort when Luke approached, like she'd been keeping watch in his absence. He rubbed her neck with a quiet familiarity. "Still here, huh?" She leaned into his touch. Around them, Mercy Ridge hummed with its slow and steady life. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find in the newspapers, No train lines, no gold strikes, but there was something enduring in the way folks moved, not with rush, but with reason, like they were rebuilding something worth remembering. Luke stepped inside the general store, where the bell above the door gave a little chime that sounded like it had rung 1,000 welcomes. Inside it smelled of old flour sacks, oiled leather, and a hint of peppermint. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 40s, hair pulled back in a bun streaked with gray. Her name tag was carved into a piece of wood. Clara. She looked up with a friendly squint. You must be the one Ezra brought in last night. Luke tipped his hat. That's me. You've already made an impression, she said, reaching for a notepad. Nate says you patched that fence like a pro. Wants to be your apprentice. Luke chuckled. He's got the makings of a good hand. Clara smiled as she handed over a jar of salve and a small tin of jerky. That one's had a quiet few years. Lost his PA in a rock slide 2 winters ago. Ain't said more than 5 words to a stranger since, but he won't stop talking about the mystery cowboys now. Luke shifted his weight, unsure how to answer. I'm no one special. Clara's eyes softened. Maybe, but sometimes it ain't about being special. It's about showing up and staying a while. He looked at the items on the counter. Put these on Ezra's tab. Clara shook her head. He already covered it. Said you were family. Far as he's concerned. Luke blinked. Not quite ready for that word. Family. It hit harder than expected. Not like a wound, but like a hand on the shoulder, when you least expect it. He left the store and wandered toward the small church at the far edge of town. Its front steps were sun-bleached and splintered, and the windows bore the cloudy marks of time and desert storms. But the door opened with ease, and the air inside was cool and quiet. Rows of pews lined the space, and at the front, a simple wooden cross hung above a modest altar. No grandeur, just stillness. Luke sat near the back, hat in his lap, eyes half closed. He didn't pray, not exactly, but he listened, to the silence, to the wind that crept through the cracks in the wood, to his own breath, steady and grounded. The door creaked gently behind him, and someone slipped inside. It was Miriam, the widow who'd sat quietly by the fire the night before, her young daughter nestled against her side. She wore a faded shawl, and held a small book to her chest. Didn't mean to disturb, she said softly. Luke shook his head. You didn't. She sat a few pews ahead of him, opened the book, and began to read aloud in a voice like wind over water, gentle, steady, low. It was a story about a river that dried up, then came back stronger after the rains, about how life returns in ways you can't always see, and how the land remembers kindness, even when people forget. Luke didn't know if it was scripture, or just something she wrote, but it settled into him, like warm sand, quieting the noise he'd carried for so long. When she finished, she closed the book, and turned slightly. You've got that look. What look's that? He asked. The kind that says you're used to carrying the weight alone. He didn't answer right away. I've had my share of miles, he finally said. So have we, she replied. But sometimes, you don't have to walk the next stretch by yourself. And with that, she stood, nodded once, and left. Luke stayed a while longer, watching the dust float in the sunbeams near the windows. The stillness wasn't empty now. It was filled with echoes, quiet ones, of people who didn't try to save him, but who'd simply let him sit still long enough to start remembering what peace felt like. Later that evening, as the sky turned to a soft wash of amber and rose, Luke found himself back by the fire with the others. The meal tonight was beans with ham, and the cornbread was crumbly and sweet. Ezra passed him a plate and a half grin. I see you met Clara and Miriam. Luke nodded. Seems like this town has a way of getting under a man's guard. Ezra chuckled. We ain't flashy, just persistent. The fire popped softly. Crickets began their evening chorus. Luke leaned back and looked toward the stars beginning to wink into view. I might stick around a few days, if that's all right. Ezra sipped his coffee. You stay as long as you need. That night, the fire burned low, and the sounds of night folded gently over the town. Luke lay awake in his cot, eyes open to the dark ceiling, and something inside him loosened. Not everything had to be carried forever. Some things could be set down, quietly, slowly, beside a warm fire in a town that still believed in healing. And as he drifted into sleep, he didn't dream of running, he dreamed of staying. The morning sun spilled like gold across the rooftops, softening the warped shingles and painting long, lazy shadows along the main road. Luke stood by the livery stable, brushing down Sable's flanks with long, rhythmic strokes. The mare leaned into it, eyes half closed, her breath steady. The tools of his old life, saddles, reins, saddlebags, were laid out neatly on the rail beside him, not for packing up, just for care. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't preparing to ride out, he was simply taking care of what he had. Behind him, the soft creak of boots on wood made him glance up. Ezra stood by the gate, hands in his coat pockets, squinting into the morning light. She looks better than most horses I've seen on the trail, he said. Luke smiled faintly. She's earned her rest. Ezra nodded and motioned down the road. Got a little something going on today. Some of the folks are fixing up the old schoolhouse. Thought you might lend a hand. Luke didn't hesitate. Lead the way. The schoolhouse sat on a gentle rise just west of the church. Its walls were warped, one shutter barely clinging to its hinge, and the roof showed a long scar where a storm had torn off part of the tin. Still, the bones of the place held strong, and that seemed to be enough for the people of Mercy Ridge. Miss Hattie stood near the entrance, sleeves rolled to her elbows and a hammer in hand. Her gray hair was tied back with a ribbon, and a smear of paint streaked across her cheek. When she saw Luke, she waved him over. You good with a brush or a hammer? I'll take whichever one's heavier, Luke said. She handed him the hammer. They worked in comfortable silence, Luke replacing boards while others repainted the door, sanded the window sills, and swept out years of dust from the floorboards. Even the children joined in, jiggling as they passed buckets or chased each other around the fence posts. It wasn't loud work, just steady. Luke climbed a ladder to fix the loose shutter, and from that high perch, he looked out over the town, the clustered rooftops, the distant fields, the horses grazing peacefully in the pasture. It wasn't much, but it was alive. He climbed down, wiped his brow, and caught sight of Miriam nearby, helping her daughter plant small wildflowers along the walkway. She glanced up and met his eyes, not with expectation or question, just acknowledgement. He offered a small nod. Later, when the work was done, and the afternoon sun had begun to soften, the townsfolk gathered near the schoolhouse steps. Clara brought lemonade, and Miss Hattie cut slices of spiced apple cake. Ezra raised his cup and cleared his throat. I reckon this little place ain't what it used to be, he said, his voice low but strong. But that don't mean it's lost its soul. Places like Mercy Ridge, they don't die easy, not so long as there's folks willing to show up, swing a hammer, and believe in the next sunrise. There was a murmur of agreement, heads nodding, smiles exchanged, and Luke, standing at the edge of the gathering, felt something stir deep inside. Not pride, exactly, not belonging, not yet, but the distant echo of it, like a door he'd kept shut slowly easing open. That evening, after the fire was lit and plates were scraped clean, Miss Hattie began telling a story. It was one of her own, from a time before Mercy Ridge, when she'd taught in a mountain town with more bears than books. She spoke of a boy who'd once refused to read, claiming books were for cowards, only to later grow up and write his own. She laughed, remembering how he used to sneak poems under her chair and deny it with a red face. The story drew quiet chuckles, the kind that softened everyone's eyes. When she finished, Ezra looked over at Luke. "You got a story?" he asked. Luke hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. He didn't talk much about the past, there was too much weight there. But tonight, under the stars and beside the fire, he felt a flicker of willingness. "I was married once," he said quietly. The group quieted, not leaning in, not pushing, just listening. "Her name was Eliza. We ran a small ranch out near Cimarron, just the two of us, a couple of ranch hands, and more stubborn cattle than we knew what to do with. We were young, thought we had time." He paused, the fire cracked, and the night waited. There was a fire, dry summer, a lightning strike caught the hay barn. "We tried to save what we could." His voice caught. "She didn't make it." No one spoke, no one needed to. Luke stared into the flames. "After that, I couldn't stay. Sold the ranch, gave the rest to the hands, took Sable, and rode." The silence sat with them, not heavy, not pitying, just present, like the land itself was holding space for the grief. Ezra lifted his cup. "To Eliza," he said simply. The others raised theirs in quiet agreement. Luke nodded once, throat tight. That night, after the fire died low, and most had gone to bed, Luke lingered. Miriam sat across from him, her daughter already asleep in her lap. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For sharing her with us." Luke blinked, surprised by the warmth in her voice. "Grief doesn't go away," she said, "but it changes, it softens, and when you let others carry just a bit of it, you realize it was never meant to be held alone." He looked at the flames, then at her, and for the first time, he believed it might be true. Morning came with a hush. No clanging bells or barking dogs, just the soft rustle of wind through cottonwoods and the slow stretching of a town waking up. Luke sat on the edge of his cot, tying his boots with steady fingers, his thoughts quieter than usual. He stepped out into the soft blue light just before sunrise. Dew clung to the edges of fence rails, and the earth smelled faintly of mesquite and ash. In the distance, the low hum of cattle drifted in from the east pasture. At the barn, Ezra was already up, tossing hay into the troughs, his motions smooth and practiced. "Early start," Ezra said without looking up. Luke grabbed a pitchfork and joined him. Old habits. They worked side by side for a while. No need for small talk. The kind of silence that comes from men who've spent a lifetime waking before the sun. When the chores were done, Ezra leaned against the rail and looked out across the pasture. "There's a thing about places like this," he said, voice low. "They don't stay alive just because people stay. They stay alive because people decide to keep building, even when it's easier to walk away." Luke nodded slowly. "I walked for a long time, and now." Luke looked toward the town, the painted schoolhouse, the slow rise of smoke from kitchen chimneys, and the morning glint of sun on Sable's coat. "I'm still figuring that out," he said. Ezra smiled. "That's the right answer." Later that day, Luke found himself helping Miss Hattie carry crates into the schoolhouse. New slates, spare pencils, and hand-stitched curtains to hang over the windows. She talked while she worked, about teaching in frontier towns, about children who grew up too fast, about the hope tucked between dusty books and long afternoons. Luke listened. When the curtains were hung and the crates unpacked, she handed him a small leather-bound book. "Found this in the back. Thought you might want it." He turned it over in his hands. The cover was worn, the corners dog-eared. A collection of cowboy poems and campfire tales, some written by hands long buried under prairie soil. "You think I look like the poetic type?" Luke asked, smiling. Miss Hattie gave a wink. You've got the soul for it. That's half the job. He tucked the book under his arm. By mid-afternoon, the sun blazed strong again, and the townsfolk gathered near the windmill to repair a broken water pipe. Luke, sleeves rolled, worked alongside Gus and Nate, taking turns at the wrench while others patched the line. It was hard work, but no one complained. Nate, face smudged with dirt, looked up at Luke between turns. You ever think about staying? Luke didn't answer right away. I think about a lot of things, he said finally. You could teach me to ride better, Nate said. Mama says I'm getting too big to just ride in circles. Luke gave him a soft smile. We'll take Sable out past the ridge this week. She knows the trail. Nate lit up like the morning sun. That evening, Luke sat near the fire again, not on the edge this time, but close to the center. His coffee cup rested warm in his hands, and the others chatted around him, easy, comfortable, like he'd always been there. Clara strummed a guitar, just a few chords, a soft tune that had no words, just feeling. Miriam sat nearby, sewing a tear in her daughter's shawl, while the little girl dozed against her side. Ezra smoked his pipe, the faint scent of cherry tobacco curling into the air, and Luke felt something new, not joy, exactly, not peace in the way folks imagine it in books, but settling, like a man whose boots had stopped moving, like a storm that had finally passed. He stood after a while, brushed the dust from his coat, and picked up the harmonica from beside the fire ring. The metal felt cool, familiar. He played a tune, low and slow, like a river winding through canyon walls, the kind of melody you don't learn but remember, one built from silence and wind, from long roads and the people who wave as you leave. The others listened, no one speaking, and when he finished, there was a long pause, then Miriam's voice, soft and certain. You belong here, Luke. The words hung in the air, like the last note of his song. He didn't answer, didn't need to, because deep in his chest, something settled, not all at once, not final, but like the first stake in the ground of a new home. He looked up at the stars, brilliant, countless, and felt them watching, not judging, just witnessing. The stranger who rode into dust wasn't a stranger anymore, and in Mercy Ridge, the dust had begun to clear. The next morning dawned warm and gold, with no clouds in the sky, just that vast open blue that stretched like a promise across the horizon. Luke stood on the porch of the bunkhouse, sipping coffee from a tin cup, the steam curling up into the cool air. Down below, the town moved slowly, waking, as it always did, not with urgency, but with purpose. Clara was already out front of the general store, arranging jars of preserves and tying sprigs of dried lavender to the posts. Miriam was at the well, filling a bucket, her daughter trailing behind, clutching a cloth doll that looked handmade and loved. Luke watched it all and felt something deep in his chest, the quiet kind of feeling that didn't shout, didn't demand attention, belonging. It came softly, like morning sun through lace curtains. You don't notice it right away, until you do. Later that day, Ezra approached him with a saddlebag slung over his shoulder. Mind giving me a hand up in the hills? He asked. Luke didn't ask questions, just nodded. They rode out together, following a narrow trail that wound through the rocky hills north of town. The horses climbed steadily, hooves clacking against stone, the wind whispering through junipers and pinyon. It wasn't until they reached a small plateau, quiet, empty, overlooking the valley below, that Ezra dismounted and motioned for Luke to do the same. They stood for a while, watching the view. Buried my wife up here, Ezra said finally, his voice low but sure. Luke turned to look at him, but Ezra kept his gaze on the distant ridgelines. Her name was May, stronger than me, in every way that mattered. She believed in this place, long after I'd lost faith. Said the land would outlive us all, that it would remember what we left behind. Luke took off his hat. I come up here now and again, Ezra continued, not to talk, just to listen. She still answers in her way. They stood in silence a while longer, the wind wrapping gently around them. I brought you here, Ezra said finally, because I think you understand. Luke nodded. I do. They didn't say anything more on the ride back. Just let the land speak. Let the horses carry them through the dust and sage. That evening, as dusk settled and the stars returned, Luke sat alone by the fire, not out of isolation, but because he needed space to think. He opened the small book Miss Hattie had given him, the one with the worn leather cover, and flipped through the pages. One poem caught his eye. A man may wander, and the world may call him free, but even in the wind, the soul still seeks a tree, some place to rest, to root, to mend, some quiet trail that has an end. He read it again and again. The words clung to him like dust, soft, weightless, but everywhere. Later, Nate padded up, bare feet, stirring the dirt. You gonna leave soon? The boy asked. Luke folded the book and looked at him. Do you want me to? Nate frowned. I don't know. I mean, you're a stranger. Luke raised an eyebrow. Still, the boy grinned. Maybe not as much. Luke ruffled his hair gently. Then I'll stay a while longer. Nate nodded, satisfied. The fire crackled, sending up small sparks into the velvet dark, and from behind them, the soft twang of Clara's guitar picked up once more. A lullaby now, slow, swaying, like a river easing into sleep. Miriam sat nearby, reading softly to her daughter, her voice almost a whisper. Luke leaned back against the log, stretched his legs out, and breathed in the scent of cedar smoke and sage. In this town, this quiet, dusty town that the world had passed by, he had found something more than rest. He had found a beginning, and for the first time in many years, Luke wasn't thinking about what came next. He was just here, in the present, in the stillness, in Mercy Ridge. The days stretched on, calm and unhurried, as summer's heat softened into mellow warmth. Mornings in Mercy Ridge began with roosters crowing and the creak of bucket pulleys at the well. By now, Luke knew the rhythm by heart, where the wind changed first, when the schoolhouse bell rang, and which chair by the fire crackled loudest when the logs settled in. He'd taken up small tasks, helping Gus mend the roof on the blacksmith shed, teaching Nate how to ride bareback, even fixing the old weather vane that had stopped turning sometime before the war. None of it was asked for. It just was. Each evening, he returned to the fire, the place where stories breathed and silence held as much meaning as words. On this night, Ezra passed around a tin of sweetened biscuits Clara had made that morning. Miriam was sewing again, her daughter asleep beneath her shawl. Miss Hattie read aloud from a local paper, months out of date, but still good for a chuckle or a sigh. Luke leaned back, watching the stars. The sky in Mercy Ridge always felt closer, like it bent lower over this little town, protective and vast all at once. After a while, Clara cleared her throat. "You'll know the fair's comin' up," she said. There was a soft murmur of acknowledgement. "We've been talking about hosting a small one here, just for us. Music, pies, a few games for the kids. Don't have to be fancy, just enough to remind ourselves we're still a community." Ezra nodded. "Been a few years since we had something worth dressing up for." Miriam looked up. "My mother used to bake strawberry preserves for the cake walk. Folks came from 2 towns over," Miss Hattie added. "And the apple bobbin. That barrel's probably still in the back shed somewhere, growing moss. Luke watched them all, their eyes lit up, their voices fuller than usual, not just remembering, reaching forward. "Guess I'll have to shine my boots," Ezra said, grinning. Nate turned to Luke, excitement on his face. "Can I ride Sable in the parade? We could tie ribbons in her mane." Luke smirked. "You're already promoting us to parade marshal." The boy laughed, bouncing where he sat. "I reckon that's a yes," Luke added softly. The planning began that very night. What stalls could be set up, what pies folks would bring, whether Gus could still play his fiddle. Luke offered to build a booth or two, and Ezra promised to fix the church bell just in time to ring it for the opening. In the days that followed, Mercy Ridge buzzed with purpose. Ribbons were cut, tablecloths stitched, and old wagons dusted off. Luke spent long hours hammering together a lemonade stand with Nate, letting the boy take the lead even when his nails went a little crooked. Miriam watched from the porch, her smile quietly grateful. One morning, she walked over, handing Luke a jar wrapped in cloth. Inside was a creamy salve, fragrant with lavender and mint. "For your hands," she said. "You've done more than your share." Luke glanced down at his palms, dry, scraped, nicked in places. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "You know, my husband used to build benches out of salvaged barnwood, said people needed a place to sit before they learned how to stand again." Luke looked at her, not just at her face, but at her strength. "I think he would have liked you," she said softly, and turned away before he could respond. That night, the campfire circle was full of laughter. Someone had found the old cakewalk signs and stuck them on wooden stakes. Clara tested her peach cobbler recipe on everyone, and Nate ran around with a lasso, trying to rope the corn stalks near the edge of the field. Luke sat back, harmonica resting in his lap. He watched Miriam and her daughter, side by side, threading string lights made from old mason jars. He watched Ezra carving new stakes for the festival flags. He watched Gus tuning his fiddle for the first time in 3 years, and he realized something he hadn't admitted until now. He cared about this town, these people, the fire, the work, the laughter. He'd spent so long protecting his pain, thinking it was all he had left of Eliza, as if holding on to sorrow was the same as holding on to her. But now, here, in Mercy Ridge beneath a sky wide enough to hold both grief and hope, he'd learned something deeper. Letting go of pain didn't mean forgetting. It meant making room for stories, for laughter, for a little boy who wanted to ride a parade horse with ribbons in her mane. Luke closed his eyes, letting the fire's warmth soak into his skin. Not a stranger anymore, not just a visitor passing through, but part of something worth building, worth staying for. Morning rolled in gentle, with clouds like brushstrokes, and the sweet scent of bread drifting from Clara's oven. The whole town seemed to wake a little earlier than usual, excitement humming beneath the surface. Only 3 days left until the Mercy Ridge Fall Fair, and the preparations had become more than just busy work. They had become a celebration before the celebration. Luke found himself in the churchyard with Ezra and Gus, sanding down old planks for benches and stalls. Nate sat cross-legged on the ground beside them, painting bright red arrows onto signs with a brush nearly twice the size of his hand. "I'm making this one say pie here," he declared proudly, "so no one gets lost." Gus nodded solemnly. "That's the most important booth, no question." Ezra chuckled as he handed Luke a mallet. "You ever think we'd be fussing over pie signs and bunting flags at our age?" Luke gave a rare smile. "I'll take this over chasing strays in a lightning storm." As the hammer met wood, and the scent of sawdust rose around them, Luke felt a strange kind of peace settle in his chest, the kind he'd chased across miles of desert and wind. It wasn't loud, it wasn't sudden, It just was. By afternoon, the whole town had gathered to raise the center tent. Fabric patched from old bed sheets and canvas tarps, dyed and stitched into one long banner that would stretch above the dance floor. Clara climbed a ladder, while Miss Hattie barked instructions from below. Higher on the left, "You're leaning toward crooked," she shouted. "I am crooked," Clara called back, laughing. Miriam worked beside Luke, tying lanterns to the posts lining the path. Her daughter toddled behind them, placing small stones along the edge, a trail of glittering river rocks she insisted would guide the dancers at night. "They shine better in moonlight," the girl whispered. Luke nodded. "Then they'll lead the way just fine." Later, as the sun dipped low, turning the canvas tent golden, the townsfolk gathered once more by the fire. No one needed to call them. They just came, drawn by instinct now, like birds to water. Tonight it was Gus's turn to tell a story. He leaned forward, poking the fire with a long stick. "Back in the war," he began, "I served under a captain who never raised his voice. He'd just look at you, real calm, real quiet, and say exactly what he needed. And somehow, folks followed him, not out of fear, not out of orders, but because you knew, deep down, he'd walk through fire for you." The fire popped softly. "I think about him sometimes when I see folks like Ezra, like Clara, like you, Luke." Luke blinked, surprised. "You don't say much," Gus continued, "but you've been here long enough to speak without words. That matters." There was no applause, no grand response, just a soft silence that felt like acceptance. And from across the circle, Luke caught Miriam's eyes. She gave him a nod, small, simple but full of meaning. Later that night, Luke walked Sable out past the edge of town. The moon was full, casting silver over the sagebrush, and the quiet was near perfect. He let her drink at the stream, and stood beside her, watching the water ripple beneath the stars. He thought of Eliza again. Not the fire, not the goodbye, just her laugh, her humming in the morning, the way she used to braid her hair on windy days. "I wish you could see this place," he said softly to the wind. "You'd like it." Sable gave a soft snort and nudged his shoulder. Luke rubbed her neck, eyes on the horizon. He didn't know how long he stood there. Could have been minutes, could have been hours, but when he turned back toward town, toward the lights flickering in windows, and the campfire glowing like a heartbeat in the dark, he felt it, that sense of returning, of home. He walked slowly, boots brushing against dry grass, harmonica in his coat pocket, and the cool breeze carrying with it the sounds of Mercy Ridge, the town that hadn't saved him with force, but with patience, with stories, with work, with a place to sit still until the dust settled. As he neared the bunkhouse, he paused, looking up at the stars one last time. "I think I'll stay," he whispered, not to the sky, not to anyone in particular, but to himself, and that was enough. The morning of the fair dawned crisp and clear. The sky, a brilliant blue, stretched wide above the gently rolling hills. A cool breeze carried the mingled scents of fresh bread, pine smoke, and blooming wildflowers. Mercy Ridge stirred to life with a quiet excitement that felt almost sacred. Luke woke early, feeling a restless energy under his skin. He dressed slowly, pulling on his worn jacket and polishing his boots. The harmonica rested on the bedside table, a familiar weight and comfort. Outside, the town was already buzzing. Stalls decorated with colorful ribbons lined the main street. Children ran in circles, faces painted with bright designs and laughter spilling like water. The smell of cinnamon and apples mingled with the earthy aroma of horses and hay. Luke found Nate near the corral, ribbons in hand and a hopeful grin. "You ready for the parade, Marshal?" the boy asked eagerly. Luke chuckled softly. "I reckon I am." They rode slowly down the main street, Sable's hooves stirring small clouds of dust. The townsfolk waved, smiling, clapping. Some held homemade signs, others simply cheered. As they passed the schoolhouse, Luke caught sight of Miriam and her daughter, waving with bright eyes and open hearts. Clara strummed her guitar from the porch, filling the air with a gentle melody. Ezra and Gus stood nearby, tipping their hats in greeting. Luke felt a swell of something deep and unexpected, not pride exactly, but a profound connection. Here, beneath the vast western sky, he was part of something larger, a story that had room for grief and joy, loss and renewal. After the parade, the fair unfolded with quiet joy. Games of horseshoes, a cakewalk, pie contests, judged with hearty enthusiasm, and laughter shared around tables, groaning under the weight of homemade food. The fire pit blazed bright that evening, casting a warm glow over faces tired but happy. Miss Hattie told stories of the old days, when the town had been young and wild. Miriam shared a song her mother used to sing. Nate and the other children danced around, their shadows flickering in the firelight. Luke sat near the center of it all, the worn leather book of poems resting in his lap. He played a soft tune on his harmonica, a melody carried on the wind and woven into the fabric of the night. The stars above shone like ancient lanterns, watching over Mercy Ridge and all who called it home.
Sand.
And for the first time in many years, Luke slept deeply, not running from the past, but resting in the promise of tomorrow. The morning light crept softly through the curtains, painting golden stripes across the wooden floorboards of the bunkhouse. Luke woke slowly, the lingering warmth of the fair still nestled deep in his bones. Outside, Mercy Ridge was stirring to another quiet day, not the bustle of the festival, but the gentle hum of a town at peace with itself. He dressed with deliberate care, tying his boots and adjusting his hat. The worn leather book of poems sat beside the door, a quiet reminder of the journey he'd taken to arrive here, to this place, to these people, to this life. Outside, the air was cool and filled with the scent of sage and cedar. The sky stretched endlessly above, a canvas of soft blues and wispy clouds. Luke took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the familiar sight of the town waking. He saw Ezra leaning against the fence, sharing a laugh with Gus. Nate was already practicing lasso tricks near the corral, his laughter ringing clear and bright. Miriam and her daughter moved quietly through the garden, tending to wildflowers and vegetables with gentle care. Luke felt the steady beat of belonging settle in his chest. He walked down the path toward the fire pit, where the last embers of the fair still glowed faintly. He knelt and ran a hand through the cool ashes, remembering the stories shared, the songs sung, the hands joined. In that moment, the dust of the past seemed to settle, not forgotten, but laid to rest. The stranger who rode into dust had found more than a town. He had found a home, and beneath the vast western sky, with the campfire crackling softly behind him, Luke knew that whatever trails lay ahead, he would face them no longer alone. Because in Mercy Ridge, there was healing, there was hope, there was quiet heroism in simply staying, simply building, simply being, and in that, there was peace. Thank you for joining this gentle journey through Mercy Ridge in the story of Luke, the stranger who rode into dust. May your nights be calm, your dreams restful, and your mornings full of hope. Good night, and sleep well.